What's up guys, welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Erdell, and in today's video we're covering the Pirc Defense from the black perspective, and specifically how to play against the Chinese variation. Now the Pirc Defense is a chess opening system for black against the move e4, in which case we're now going to continue with d6, allowing white to simply take full control of the center of the board, but this is exactly what we want. This is a hyper dynamic system for black in which we're going to go after that center for the rest of the game, eventually preparing e5 and c5 breaks, which by the way, we've already started to do at move 1. Here we're going to continue with knight f6, attacking that centralized pawn, and now following knight c3, we see g6. We're going to continue by fianchettoing our bishop, and so far this game seems pretty normal, but all of a sudden we see white play this move g4, and we're in the Chinese variation. And I'm not going to lie, black can fall into trouble pretty quickly here if we don't know what we're doing. I mean, for example, let's just say we play normal looking Pirc Defense chess with a move like c6, preparing b5. Well, now white plays this move g5, and if we decide to bring our knight back to a square like d7, we see h4. We're currently in a race to see who can attack the fastest on their side of the board. And guys, white is way ahead in this race right now. I mean, pawns on g5 and h4, h5 just one move away, putting pressure on g6. There's a ton of attacking ideas here for white, and I'm not going to sit here and say that it's losing for black, but this is not the start we want. So y'all, facing this very interesting and unique idea of bishop e2, preparing an immediate g4, I think we as black also have to change our approach. Some players like to play this move c5, but if you look at master and grandmaster level games, there's this underrated move of d5, immediately putting pressure on e4. And this actually scores very well at the elite level. White wins 19% of the time. There's a draw 31% of the time, and the other 50% of games go to a decisive result for black. So this move with d5 has become very hard for white to deal with in terms of opening theory. And notice, by the way, we're not worried about g5 anymore because we'd simply take that pawn on e4. In today's video, we're going to be covering the main option and best move for white, which is simply expanding with e5. But let's first cover a couple of different options. First off, what happens if white just takes on d5? Well, in this case, let's take back with a knight. And all of a sudden, it's like, what is this pawn really doing on g4? If anything, it's just a big target. Right now, we're putting pressure on c3 and d4 with our very active bishop on g7. c5 ideas on the way. And if white plays a move like knight takes d5, we're simply going to take back with the queen, threatening to win a rook. And white can save this rook by playing bishop f3, but they're still going to lose a pawn. And in a situation like this, I mean, white might want to play a move like queen e2, trying to keep material on the board because they're currently down one pawn. But guys, in this situation, I actually think that it's black in the driver's seat. We have an active queen on d4, active bishop on g7, and look at the white pieces. This knight on g1 is not really going anywhere anytime soon. This bishop on c1 can't even move right now unless they want to lose that pawn on b2. So now as black, we're just going to continue with knight c6, and here if we see something like c3, the computer recommendation is queen a4, but I think a more natural move is just bringing this queen back to e5, right? I mean, we're up a pawn, we're up development, why not just start trading off the pieces? And if white declines this with bishop e3, we can simply castle kingside. Here in this position, guys, we have ideas like bishop e6, putting pressure on the queen side of the board, followed by putting a rook on d8. We obviously have a very active queen, and I just don't see how white's going to have a very comfortable game going forward. So y'all, going back to this position, we play this move d5, putting pressure on the white camp. And if white takes on d5, we're simply going to take back, and we're the ones with a much more comfortable game there. What about this move f3? This is actually a decent attempt by white, just trying to hold their pawn structure together. But in this case, I recommend just taking the pawn and then simply castling kingside. Some of you guys may be wondering, and for good reason, I mean, why on earth would we ever want to castle kingside here? It seems as if white's pawns are so advanced and they have attacking chances, but at the same time, we're actually ahead in development. We have two minor pieces developed, and so does white, but we also have our king castled against moves like h4. We have c5 ideas available, trying to break this game open. And notice here, if a move like e5 expanding, we can play knight d7 and c5. Again, just putting as much pressure on those dark squares as we possibly can. And if g5, I actually like this move knight e8, bringing this knight to the back rank. This may seem passive, but it's anything but. Guys, we can't play passive chess. We can't play moves like c6, knight d7, a6. This is just going to give white time to continue with bishop e3, queen d2, start throwing down this pawn like there's no tomorrow. We have to put the pressure on white. And really, by doing this move knight e8, we're threatening to simply win that pawn on d4, and if white defends it with a move like bishop e3 or knight f3, we're simply going to play c5. Again, putting more pressure. White can decide to take this pawn whenever they want. When they do, we're going to take on c3, giving white triple isolated pawns. and we're going to continue to play aggressive and hyperdynamic chess. If a move here like bishop e3, let's continue by putting pressure on one of the defenders of the pawn on d4, and eventually white's going to have to make a choice on what they want to do with this pawn, right? I mean, here if white takes on c5, again, we have that idea of capturing off that knight, and now just sliding our queen up one square to c7. And yes, guys, we're currently down a pawn, but look at white's pawn structure. I mean, this is some of the worst pawn structure, if not the worst pawn structure I've ever seen this early in the game. I mean, right now, white has 2 isolated pawns and triple isolated pawns along the c-file. There's just no way white's going to be able to hold on to all these pawns for very long. And I mean, honestly, if you're in this position and you want to even out the material really quickly, you can play knight d7 and try to take on c5. Or if you're comfortable with a position like this, you could always just play knight c6, play rook d8, and keep putting the pressure on white. There's simply nothing white's going to be able to do to hang on to their extra pawn. And on top of that, our king on g8 is very safe right now. So again, y'all, we're putting as much pressure as we possibly can on that d4 pawn, even attacking one of the defenders on f3. And if white ever does take on c5, give your opponent triple isolated pawns, play queen c7, and you're going to be in business. What about this move d5? White just trying to expand in the center of the board. Well, in this case, I actually like taking on f3, and then playing this move knight d6, a very solid option for black. And on top of that, our bishop on g7 is doing a great job of controlling these dark squares. Potential ideas include knight d7, developing our pieces, eyeing that e5 square, and defending the c-pawn. And another option here for black is something like queen b6, defending this pawn, and putting pressure on b2. And notice here, if white takes the pawn on c5, this is a little bit overambitious because of knight c4. Just getting our knight into the action here, attacking the pawn on b2. And here, if white tries to hold on to it with something like queen c1, we're simply going to continue with queen a5. And white was the one that tried to play very aggressive and attacking chess here with the Chinese variation. But it turns out it's actually black who is the one right now that is holding all the pressure. White's in big, big trouble right now. So y'all, going back to this position after the move d5, that covers f3, in which case we can simply capture on e4, castle kingside, and find our time to strike, really going after those central pawns and trying to break that position open as we're ahead so much development. What about this move e5? Now, this is the best move for white, and my recommendation here for black is knight e4, putting our knight in the center of the board, attacking the knight on c3. And the move here that you're probably going to see the most often is white just taking the knight on e4. So we're going to be covering this move first. We're also going to be covering other ideas such as queen d3 and h4, which you may see from time to time. And finally, my recommendation, the very rare move f4. I think that this is the best option for white. But even after this, I think that black has a playable game. So what about this move knight takes e4? Well, in this case, we're simply going to take back with our pawn. And you could make the argument that we have double pawns, but at the same time, how is this pawn on e4 really going to be attacked anytime soon? It's making things awkward for white right now, and it's going to be hard for white to pick off this pawn anytime soon. I mean, here if white plays a move like bishop e3, we're actually just going to continue with c5. This is a key idea in the Pirc Defense, guys, especially against the Chinese variation. You're going to see this move come out time and time again. If white wants to take that pawn, we're okay being down a pawn for a little bit. Let's just castle kingside. If white wants to take off our queen, that's okay. We're now attacking the pawn on e5. And if white tries to hold on to that pawn, we can continue with knight c6. And the very next move, capture on e5. We're the ones with the active pieces, and we're prepared to meet f takes e4 by playing knight takes g4. We also have ideas such as bishop e6, playing rook ac8, and putting pressure on c5. We're in business. So y'all, in this position and many others, white can take that pawn, but they're just going to end up with a ton of weaknesses, and we're going to be the one with the piece activity. What if white tries to hold on here with a move like c3? Okay, let's play knight c6, continuing to add the pressure on that d4 pawn. And now if white tries a move like bishop b5, which is a decent attempt, trying to pin the knight to the king on e8, I'm actually okay with just castling kingside. Whole idea being if this bishop snatches off our knight, we can simply capture back. And yet again, if white wants to take our pawn on the c-file, that's okay. Let's just play rook b8. We're down a pawn, but only for a little bit. We're attacking the pawn on b2, attacking the pawn on e5, and this pawn on g4. And notice here, if I move like b3, trying to hang on to that b pawn, let's just take this pawn on e5, attacking the pawn on c3. And guys, I don't see how white's going to be surviving this position very long. So y'all, in this position, if white takes the knight on c4, which again is probably what you're going to see most of the time, just take that minor piece back, continue with c5, and put as much pressure as you can on that pawn. If white wants to take and mess up their pawn structure and really make that pawn on e5 a big weakness, that's completely okay. And if not, we're just going to continue to activate our pieces. What are a couple other options that white has here? Well, sometimes we'll see this move queen d3. White just trying to keep the peace, attacking this knight on e4. Whole idea being, I mean, if we take on c3, white could simply capture back. But here we're going to play the move c5 as black, an aggressive option, putting pressure on d4 while also putting a little bit of pressure on c3 and e5. Now, first off, the big question, why can't white just snatch off our knight? Well, in this case, we're simply going to take back with the d-pawn, and white is ahead of pawn, but not for very long. I mean, we're just going to play c takes d4. We've already evened out the material. We're going to continue with knight c6, defending that d-pawn and attacking the pawn on e5, and black with nearly a -1 advantage. So if white takes the knight on c4, we're simply going to capture back and win that centralized pawn on the d-file. And notice here, by the way, I mean, if white wants to play a move like f4, that's okay. We'll just continue to mount the pressure. And if white ever captures the pawn on c5, we have quite a few different options here. One of them is just taking the knight on c3 and then continuing with knight c6, double attacking that pawn on e5. We're down a pawn, but again, white's going to give up a lot if they try to hold on to it. Here, if we see the move bishop f4, let's just continue with d4, expanding in the center of the board, really cutting off this queen from that pawn on e5. And notice here, if a move like queen g3, trying to hold on to that pawn with desperation, white simply can't hold on to everything. We're going to play queen a5 with check, snatch off that c-pawn, and yet again, we have 3 pieces all attacking that pawn on e5, and this pawn on g4 is also looking like a big weakness. We're going to continue to develop our pieces, and we have ourselves a very nice lead. So y'all, against this move queen d3, let's just play c5 and try to put as much pressure on that center as we possibly can. What about the move h4? Simply ignoring our move of knight e4 and expanding on the king side. Well, yet again, we're going to continue with c5. This is the key move here for black at move 7 against a ton of these variations. Here we're putting pressure on d4, and if h5 is played, continuing to advance, we're simply going to capture in the center and then play knight c6. We're attacking the queen and attacking this pawn on e5. And here, y'all, we're going to cover this move bishop b5, pinning our minor piece to the king on e8. But let's first cover the obvious question, why doesn't white just take on d5? Well, right now we actually have a single move that gives us the lead. Any other move for black simply gives white a much better game. The move here for black is knight takes c3, a nice little intermediate move, snatching off that minor piece. Obviously, if white wants to take the knight, we're simply going to win a queen because this queen no longer has a defender. And if the move queen takes d8 is played, we'll simply capture back with the king, take on e5 with our knight. We have 2 active pieces with our knight on e5 and our bishop on g7. And on top of that, our bishop on c8 is also an active piece, putting pressure on g4, even though our bishop on c8 has not even moved. White, on the other hand, has some big weaknesses that they're going to have to work with for the rest of the game. I mean, an isolated pawn, double isolated pawns, and these pawns on g4 and h5 are simply way too overextended. On the black side, we really don't have any weaknesses to speak of. You could argue that the king is a little bit vulnerable on d8, but honestly, we are approaching the endgame, and an active king is exactly what you want. So y'all, that covers this move, queen takes d5. In that case, just snatch off that knight on c3. Be prepared to play king takes d8, win that central pawn, and you're going to have yourself a much better endgame. What about this move, bishop b5? Trying to pin the knight to the king on e8. Well, in this case, I simply like to castle kingside. Whole idea being we're yet again installing the threat of winning that queen because this knight is no longer pinned. And if white tries to pick our knight off, okay, we're simply going to continue by playing knight takes c3 yet again. Whole idea being, look, if you want to win our knight, we're going to win your piece. There's a couple of different ways that white can try to hold on to material here, but none of them work. For example, if bishop takes b7, we'll take back, and after b takes c3, white is up a pawn, but yet again, we have more than enough compensation. In fact, right now we have this key attacking idea of rook c8 and rook c4. I mean, just activating our major piece. And this king on e8 could potentially be in some major trouble. Let's play this move rook c8, and if a move like knight f3, or really no matter what white plays, we have that option of eventually playing rook c4, attacking that queen. And notice here, no matter where this queen goes, let's say a move like queen takes a7 is played, now white going up 2 pawns, we can still play queen c8. We're attacking the pawn on c3, the pawn on g4 with 2 major pieces, the pawn on e5. We also have potentially some rook e4 check ideas against this king. And guys, white is in big trouble. So y'all, if you see this move bishop takes c6, simply take back on c3 and continue to play aggressive and attacking chess, and you're going to have yourself some hyper-dynamic play and a really fun game ahead. What happens if white here takes on d5 with the queen, playing bishop b5 first and then taking on d5? Well, in this case, again, that key idea, let's remove the defender on c3. White cannot take back unless they want to lose their queen on d5. And here, if white takes our queen, okay, we're going to play rook takes d8 and then play knight takes e5, attacking that pawn on g4, activating both of our rooks very soon, and white is going to have a very hard time holding on here. So y'all, going back to this position, if you do see the move of h4, simply continue with c5. And if you see h5 again, take on d4, play knight c6. Whole idea being whenever queen takes d5 is played, you have that knight takes c3 idea in the air, and you're going to have yourself a better game. Now, what is the move that I recommend white play in this position besides taking on e4, besides playing queen d3 or h4? What do I recommend? Well, guys, what happens if white moves this pawn? Now, first off, f3 is a decent option, but against this, we're just going to take on c3 and play c5, and we have a solid game. I think the best move here for white is actually f4, expanding. I mean, we've already pushed our pawns this far. Why not just keep going? Putting some extra protection on that pawn on e5, which, as we've seen, has fallen in a ton of the variations that we've just covered. In this position, guys, again, we're going to play c5, putting pressure on d4. And yet again, white has a single move that gives them a slightly better position, and that is taking on e4. And now after d takes e4, we're again putting pressure on that d4 pawn. And now the move d5 can be a little bit intimidating for black to deal with, but we're actually going to invite this pawn to keep going forward. We're going to play this move e6, prepared to meet c4 with f6. And at first sight, it may seem as if black is losing that position because these pawns are so far advanced, but at the same time, after c4 and f6, we have a pawn and a bishop putting pressure on e5, and we have a pawn and a queen putting pressure on d5. And yes, white's position is very advanced, but white has a big job ahead of them, and that is just trying to hold on to all those advanced pawns. If white continues to push with the move d6, notice what this move e6 did. It did invite this move d6 from white, but on top of that, we can now play queen h4, our queen coming out of nowhere, attacking this king. The whole idea being, I mean, here, if a move like king f1, we have to undermine these pawns, guys. In a position like this, when your opponent has a huge advantage in space, we can't just play normal-looking moves like castling kingside, bishop d7, knight c6. We have to try to take these pawns off the board, starting off with g5. Whole idea being, look, we're attacking that pawn on f4. If white takes on g5, we're going to play bishop takes e5. And here, if a move like bishop e3, we're going to start to chip away at this pawn chain. Take on f4. And after bishop takes f4, play knight c6, double attacking the pawn on e5. The biggest way to potentially win the pawn on d6 is by taking off the pawns that currently defend it. And by the way, this pawn on d6 may seem very intimidating, but at the same time, where is this pawn going to go? It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And in the meantime, we're trying to break down white's central pawn chain. If a move here like queen d6, very sneaky option from white, we got to be careful. We can't play a move like taking on e5 with either of our minor pieces because of bishop g5 trapping our queen, and we're going to have a completely losing position. But what we can do here is black is play a move like h6, defending that square, play a move like queen d8, just getting our queen out of there, or even this move f6. I personally like this move a lot, just putting as much pressure on e5 as we possibly can, defending the g5 square as well. And here, y'all, as black, we've achieved at least equality. If you'd like to learn the theory behind the Pirc defense as a whole, click that video to the left. If you'd like to learn our top 10 chess openings for black against the move d4, click that video to the right. Leave a comment down below to let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.